everyone. This is Jeanette Chiliga with VG, and I am here with the hysterical Debra Dudek, and she's going to be sharing a presentation with us with that time Martha Washington's will was stolen. Debra, thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. And thank you so much, friends, for joining us for VGA's 4th birthday. When I was asked to give a fun, lighthearted presentation that wouldn't take a whole lot of time, I really had to pare this one down, but it's one of the best adventure stories when we think about vital records. And it's kind of, it's good every once in a while to get yourself out of your own research and then to kind of pursue another avenue of looking at vital records and seeing them not as the documents that go to making your, putting flesh on the bones of your own ancestors, but what they mean to us as on a level of record keeping, not only for a state or a county, but as a society in general. And this is the best story I could think of. This is that one time that Martha Washington's will was stolen, because I can guarantee you, you might have never heard the story. If you're in Daughters of the American Revolution, this is one of the freebie sessions that I do for chapters, because it's important to show how essential women were in the fight to get Martha Washington's will back. So let's talk about setting the scene a little bit. On May 22nd, 1802, a frail woman lay dying in the 3rd floor bedroom of the Washington family estate in Mount Vernon. She should have been surrounded by her children, but she had outlived all 4 of them. And the only family she had left were 4 grandchildren and a smattering of great-grandchildren. Everyone else was gone. 2.5 years before, Martha Washington had sat at the bedside of her beloved second husband as he slipped away in their airy 2nd floor chamber, the one they'd shared since they had arrived at the Mount Vernon estate. So to the young nation he had founded, George Washington's passing had elevated him to that of a religious figure. It was his wife who swallowed her sadness, greeted the hundreds of guests who arrived, and promptly moved her possessions to a smaller 3rd floor room of the house. She couldn't bear to sleep in the same room without her husband by her side. So as she lay dying, America was soon to lose a somewhat silent founding mother, one who was committed to being a devoted wife, and also who provided encouragement and advice during the tumultuous winter in Valley Forge. Her husband's service to the country had been at a sacrifice to the quiet country life they really had desired. But before her final illness, her surviving grandchildren provided a reprieve from the constant strain of receiving visitors and dignitaries and her own deeply held grief. Her personal affairs had been put in order in the form of a will written by her granddaughter, Eleanor Parke Custis Lewis, who you'll see here on the right, and was signed by Martha on September 2nd, 1800. So when Martha Washington exhaled for the last time, the heirs to her estate would go about the process of ensuring her final wishes and financial obligations were concluded. She would never know the process would become mired in a testy legal scuffle, which is a whole nother topic. And it also included the division of estates, not only the estate, but the ownership of enslaved persons that she had inherited from her first marriage. So in accordance to her will at the time, Martha Washington's will became the property of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it was placed in Fairfax County Courthouse alongside her husband's when the document was probated on June 21st, 1802. And her husband's will was already there. It was filed away with a multitude of other documents, legal files, documents, and all the minutiae and paperwork that's contained within this very small, squat brick building. But soon, and here's an example of the wills, because we have to look at that. So, but soon when the legal battles were over and Martha Washington's will would just kind of slip silently into history, just like her husband's, but the document itself would sleep very, very quietly for 60 years before another American war would sweep through Virginia with a ferocity that Martha Washington could have never imagined. So during the Battle of Bull Run in late August, Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson of the 82nd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteers made Fairfax County Courthouse his headquarters. And when Thompson arrived, he stated the building was already been vandalized and by a command of men noted for their reckless vandalism. There was paper and furniture strewn all over the building, and the large amounts of stored documents had been used to kindle fires to ward off the cold. So upon entering the room, Thompson saw his men were already at work pawing through papers to light fires in empty grates. And Thompson said he told his men to stop and began looking over the documents. And in their possession, they found the will of Martha Washington. Now, Thompson kept the document for safekeeping. And when the Union Army moved out, he took the will, placed it in his saddlebags, and rode off. Now, Thompson had a very highly distinguished military career. He was eventually would become general, and a total history spoiler, he became a supervisor of military pensions in Washington, D.C. at the end of his life. So he kept the will of Martha Washington in his possession until 1892, when he gifted the document to his daughter, Mary Epsie Thompson. Mary Epsie Thompson had no husband. She didn't have a father and probably a very limited income. So Mary decided to start shopping the document out as a way to support herself. So around that time, because there's a lot of interested buyers in Martha Washington's will, there were laws, of course, on the books about ensuring that documents were being kept in a location, they had to be stored there, but enforcing it is a totally different situation. And so around the time that Mary Epsie Thompson starts shopping around Martha Washington's will to sell, the Fairfax County clerk, F.W. Richardson, starts getting letters of inquiry from various different buyers asking if this will is legit. And he says, and this is like the best bit, he responds to these letters by saying that the document in question could not be purchased because it was the rightful property of Fairfax County. So if it was for sale, it wouldn't be the real document, or it shouldn't be for sale because it belongs to Fairfax County. So he responded to each one of these letters as saying, if it is the real deal, it needs to be back with us. But they didn't really put two and two together. Finally, Martha Washington sold the will to J.P. Morgan Sr., who with that ginormous schnoz that's over here on the left. And she sold it to him in 1903 for $3,500. And if anybody knows anything about J.P. Morgan at this time period, he is buying anything that's not nailed down. Him, Henry Ford, any of these robber baron, super wealthy elite from the Gilded Age are buying up everything, every kind of document, any kind of artwork. Small buildings in, Seville, Spain are being shipped over for them to make some sort of entryway for their ginormous mansion, that sort of thing. That's what's going on with Morgan. But Morgan loves old records. He loves records, artwork, paperwork, doesn't matter. He's going to buy it. And so here's the deal, that Morgan, once they kind of figured out that that Morgan had this will, nothing was really done. There were a couple letters that were sent by Fairfax County saying, we've had reports that you've purchased Martha Washington's will, but it's J.P. Morgan. He has a lot of sway, and it honestly doesn't bother him. He doesn't even bother to respond to anything from Fairfax County because it's just one county in the Commonwealth of Virginia. What does it mean to them? So he starts, the Fairfax County clerk Richardson drops this, just kind of lets it go its own way because he's not really sure if it's the real deal. Again, we're not, we're kind of playing the games of it could possibly be, but not really. Nobody's really seen it until J.P. Morgan dies. He dies at the St. Regis Hotel in Rome on March 31st, 1913. And what happens when somebody dies? Well, you got to have an inventory. You got to go through the estate. And in the estate, when it was being settled, there was a bulk of business interests being inherited by his son, Morgan Jr. And that's when the matter of Martha Washington's will really steps into the spotlight. So among the mention of Morgan Sr.'s death, because I'll call him Morgan Sr. and then there's Morgan Jr. I'll just call Jr. because it just makes this story a lot more interesting. So among Morgan Sr.'s death is a listing of everything he owns, and that includes Martha Washington's will. And the people of Fairfax County start connecting the dots and go, oh crap, those letters we've received about Martha Washington's will being sold are true. So in 1913, there are 3 DAR chapters in Virginia: Fairfax County, Mount Vernon, and the Fells Church chapter. Fells Church is the one that we're going to keep our eye on. So after the death of Morgan Sr., Mrs. Mary Grimsley Babar of the Falls Church chapter of the NSDAR became championing a campaign to convince Morgan Jr. to do the right thing and return Martha Washington's will to the original location at the Fairfax County Courthouse. And this is the letter that she sends. Now, she mobilized her entire chapter, not just her chapter. She starts mobilizing other movers and shakers within the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the Fairfax chapters are become abundantly aware that the sale of Martha Washington's will back in 1903 had basically been dropped by a group of men. And so they're like, we're going to go in and we're going to get this job done. So Mary Babar looks at each other and says, these guys can't handle it without us telling them how to do this. So it's time for us women to clean up the mess and get things sorted out. So Morgan Jr., unfortunately, what he didn't really know of is that he's holding a highly explosive bag. And I love this because his father purchased Martha Washington's will in 1903, and there had already been multiple lawsuits about colonial records being stolen during the Civil War. And his father had always used this excuse in some of his correspondence later, that his father had told him, oh, it was spoils of war, so I can have whatever I want. It was spoils of war, and so if I bought it, it's now mine. And there were multiple legal cases that had taken place, which I go in a whole nother lecture, which had basically said, if it was stolen and it was stolen from this location, there need to be terms, they need to be returned, there needs to be some sort of justice to make the situation whole. So there had been previously stolen documents from the Marquis de Lafayette, which had actually been returned to the family or donated to an institution, and other donations had been made. So it was Morgan Jr. had inherited stolen property, and now he's just kind of being cavalier about it, but he did not have the same sway as his father. But after the ladies of Fells Church chapter, they met, they write this letter and they send it off to Junior. And of course, all of this is what I love. All of this correspondence was issued in the Falls Church chapter of the annual report that they sent to the national DAR, like reports for the year. And they're all on Google Books. So you can read all of them. You can read the whole saga, every piece of paper that's sent between the two. And this is the letter that they received back from one of Junior's little lackeys, one of his little secretaries. And they basically say, Mr. Morgan's in Europe, but I'll give you his letter when he returns back in the middle of December. Yours truly, so-and-so. I added the frowny face at the bottom. So I'm just letting you guys know that's probably what it felt like when they received this letter. So of course, again, this is issued in their annual report. So then a month later, they get a response from Morgan Jr.'s librarian. And there's a great book about Belle de Castro Green. It's a fictional account. She's called like the Morgan Librarian. I think it's some sort of book around that. And it's a fascinating book on its own. But the Morgan family had hired her to be the curator of all of the items that they're purchasing. And she sends this very nice letter back. She says, dear DAR chapter, Mr. Morgan desires me to say that he regrets he's unable to basically acquiesce to your request. And the will of Martha Washington will not be returned to Fairfax County. And Mr. Morgan desires me to say that he will be glad to have this will photographed and sent to you in such photographs if you desire. You would appreciate the return courtesy of a photographic reproduction of the will of George Washington, which is deposited in the archives of Fairfax County. So basically, again, Morgan Jr. is being exceptionally cavalier about the whole situation. Now, I don't know if anybody knows this, but this is when you say, if there was that moment where it belongs in a museum, starts to kind of cry out here, this is what the Fells Church chapter starts to say. We asked nicely, but you're not doing the right thing, and you're not doing what we're telling you to do, which is to return this back to the county courthouse and Falls Church chapter starts to mobilize. Now, they just don't go on a letter writing campaign for the Commonwealth. Oh no, oh no. Those delicate little white gloves are off, and they start writing every chapter in the country. Not only do they start writing every single chapter, they get those chapters to work with other organizations, other historic preservation organizations, and then they start going to the press. They start going to the media. They start showing up at supervisor meetings. And it also helps out that during this whole organizational process of this push, this campaign to get Martha Washington's will back, that several members of the Falls Church chapter and other chapters, their husbands are all on the county board of supervisors, or their state representatives, or their state senators. It's super helpful to have that on there. Now, the Virginia legislature, and I love this, this is from Abby Farwell Ferry. She was the Chicago chapter regent of my chapter up here in Chicago. And this is from January 7th, 1914, during that letter writing campaign that Falls Church is asking every chapter to do. And Abby Farwell Ferry has the best quote. She says, the daughters will certainly have something to say about this. So it seems, you know, she has this wonderful quote. I use a lot of it, but basically she says, Mr. Morgan will be politely asked by 120,000 women to return the stolen will to the records of Fairfax County. I intend to bring this matter before the Chicago daughters at our next meeting. This made national headlines. This made front page news in multiple newspapers. It was in the Chicago papers for at least a week. So Abby Farwell Ferry was one of those women who don't take nothing laying down. And once Falls Church asked for that help, she and other chapters around the country start to deliver. Now, with Falls Church, here's the interesting thing about Falls Church chapter. Yes, they've got connections. Yes, there's starting to be women's enfranchisement. Illinois would actually have enfranchisement in 1913, a little bit later in the summer, but Virginia does not. And on top of that, the Virginia legislature meets only once every 2 years. So it did not provide the chapter a lot of time to organize, which is why they started to use their considerable social and political connections to introduce a Virginia state bill. This is 14 days later. This is 14 days after Abby Farwell Ferry puts that article in the paper, has that article written in the Chicago newspapers and other newspapers around the country. And so they mobilize in less than 2 weeks and get a state bill passed, which is approved by the governor that says, you know what, I'm going to go and I'm negotiate with Morgan on behalf of Fairfax County, on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia. We're going to get this will back. So Falls Church submits its reports of activities, like I showed you earlier, to the NSDA Annual Continental Congress, and battle lines start being drawn. And if this is a longer, presentation about how certain New York chapters don't want anything to do with it because they're in big with the Morgans. So it's a whole like little Gilded Age DAR drama, HBO Max worthy. But as it sits, so Governor Stewart starts going to war, a war of words. And if you guys ever heard that song by Hamilton, I have the honor to be your obedient servant. It's all that back and forth, multiple letters. So here is a letter from Governor Stewart writing to Morgan Jr. here. And he says, Morgan Jr. puts up all of these concerns being a big one. He says, okay, the Fairfax County Courthouse is not fireproof. And that my father said this is spoils of war. And that I'm looking at this and saying, well, we've had it for so long and we're taking such good care of it. Why can't we just, keep it in my collection? Or could I then donate it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association? If you'll donate the will of George Washington, they can both be at Mount Vernon. But here's the bit, J.P. Morgan Jr. Is the head of the board of the Mount Vernon Association. So as you can see, he still wants his fingers on this will. He's holding on to it with his very, very fingertips. And this is a letter back from Governor Stewart. And he says, I would love to have this. I would love to put this here. But these are the concerns that Morgan Jr. is facing. And this is Stewart's response. And he says, look, and this is what I love. The DAR is in this letter without actually being named. And you'll see it here. It's in the purple. He says, after getting to the facts fully before me, I regret to say that your letter does not meet the views of the people whom I represent and for whom I speak. And you'll see this again. Since it is stated by prominent persons of the county that the clerk's office is capable and observant people, that this will be absolutely safe in this building. So he's naming the DAR without actually naming the DAR in this document. And Governor Stewart basically takes any of Morgan's little complaints and poo-poos them and says, give me my will, we want the will. Morgan Jr. holds out again. He says, we've been through this. I tried to come to a compromise, but it doesn't look like we're going to be able to come to it. So these little letters go back and forth. And again, all of this was submitted in the Falls Church chapter annual reports. So you can go through and read all of this. So finally, Morgan thinks, okay, we're just going to run the clock out. We're going to run the clock out. We're going to wait. The legislature session ends. They only meet every 2 years. So I'm just going to run the clock out and just see if I can get this. Now, here's the best bit. The governor, after talking to various people and including those husbands, including those wives, without being named, in October. So again, this is October 1914. So all this stuff starts happening in January. By October, the gloves are really off. It is bare knuckle. It is bare knuckle and ready to go. That this is the next step in the process, which is the Commonwealth of Virginia and Fairfax County lodging a Supreme Court filing. They're going to take Morgan Jr. to the Supreme Court to get this will back. And you can see that this is part of that issue, that before something ever really goes to the Supreme Court, there has to be a filing and there has to be items set on both sides. So you have to be able to provide proper documentation. The filing's just the first move, but the state of Virginia, they're not waiting anymore. And all of those women who are pushing to get this will back are not waiting anymore. They're going to the Supreme Court. And at the same time, Morgan is getting absolutely hammered in the press. The press loves this story. It is the best story on the planet because JP Morgan, as much as he's able to say in his testimony as he starts kind of getting his written testimony up for the Supreme Court filing, saying, oh, Miss Mary Epsie Thompson was the daughter of General Thompson, and about I've been taking such good care of the documents and how we should make it available at Mount Vernon. It's cute, but it's not a convincing argument. And so he just gets hammered in the press. The press follow him everywhere, asking, why don't you give the will back? Just give the will back. The will belongs to Fairfax County. That's the right thing to do. So they hammer him, the press. This man cannot go anywhere without being badgered constantly and harassed. And this is one of the best headlines I saw. To make J.P. Morgan, disgorge his stolen will. It's just great. It's just a great story. And they do mention the DAR in this article, how they are the women who are pushing to have this will return. And you see, of course, the librarian there and the Attorney General of Virginia and the little Fairfax County courthouse. He's just basically getting hammered everywhere he goes. So in a little bit of political maneuvering, the Supreme Court has taken a look at all of the bill of complaints that Morgan Jr. is filling out, and that's happening in 1915. So they give him until October 1915 to fill out. They give him a whole year. So sometime and Morgan Jr. takes about a year. He finally finishes the bill of complaint in September of 1915. So it's now been almost a year. And he writes to his friend, Judge James Keith, who's the president of the appeals court in Virginia, to kind of help massage this situation out. And Judge Keith comes up with this idea. He's like, look, let's see if we can postpone the Supreme Court case, and then we'll get the General Assembly of Virginia back together, and we'll discuss to see if we can come to another kind of compromise. That are we going to have both wills sent to Mount Vernon? Are we going to have both wills sent to the Library of Congress? And so Morgan Jr. sends Martha Washington's will directly to Judge Keith for safekeeping. This is October 1915. But then something happens, and we're not sure what. I've consulted multiple people from multiple courthouses, the Morgan Library, who will not return my emails anymore, about what exactly is happening and what changes. So Morgan sends the Martha Washington's will to Judge Keith in September 30th, right before October 1st. And then something happens where on the bit, like a couple of days later, Judge Keith walks the will into Governor Stewart's office in Virginia and hands it over to him in an envelope. That's it. That's all that happens. Something happens between that time period. So we're not sure if it was a private conversation, if it was a letter, if Morgan just gave up, maybe he didn't want the Supreme Court case. We don't know what happened. What we do know is as of October 6th, while the will is sitting in Governor Stewart's fireproof safe in his office, the Fairfax County supervisors pass a resolution for the will to be returned to the courthouse. And this is the terms of that agreement, which basically just says, it's been delivered to the governor, it's going to be restored, it's going to be in Fairfax County in perpetuity, and all of that is approved on the same day. So again, why was it returned? We're not sure. There's no notes. There's nobody from the library. There's no one from the Morgan estate, nobody from the courthouse. I mean, they'll give a presentation that's kind of similar, but nobody really has an answer as to why Morgan or a conversation he had with Keith just turned the will over. Nobody knows. But where is the will today? Because I think that's what's an important thing, is that where is the will? Well, it's back in Fairfax County with George Washington's. And here's the other bit too, is that every year they have a couple presentations. They talk about this. The wills they'll have out on display every once in a while, but they've been digitized and transcribed for the public. And that's a really nice bit, is that it was returned after a very lengthy fight, but a fight that really only took a year. And we have to acknowledge this, that it was won, I wouldn't say single-handedly, but it was mobilized by a group of women who did not have the right to vote, who did not sit in any political office, who basically used their clout and their ability to mobilize to get one of the most powerful men in the United States to hand over a piece of stolen public property and return to the public where it belongs. So in my handout, which I'm going to put in the chat at the end of this session, I've got some reading and resources with those links to the Washington Wills and the Fairfax County Courthouse. And if anybody's looking for a fun transcription project that's not the 1950 census, because I know my friend Maria loves the 1950 census, we all love it, but they're looking to transcribe more of the Martha Washington papers that are available. So that's a fun one. And then I've got some good reading recommendations down here, which the big one, of course, is the First Lady's Republic, which is good. And a big shout out if the Martha Washington Cookbook. Now, there's a couple editions of it. The original was donated to, I think, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, something along those lines. They published it as a fundraiser in the early 1900s, and you can go today and you can go through and get at least a typeset 1902, nicely, politely transcribed cookbook copy of Martha Washington's original cookbook, which includes the recipe to make George Washington's favorite cake. It's more of like a fruit cake, and this is a huge recipe, but I'm just putting it in there because I made it once and it's delicious, but it's very dense. And I recommend a lot of tea, a lot of coffee, whatever sort of strong hot drink that you can put in there. That's what you want to correspond it with. So for that, I'm going to go to questions and put the handout in this area. Oopsie. So as I go through it. So don't look at that. There we go. Perfect. All right. How's it going? Any questions? That's it.